Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be doing the B550 motherboard roundup in order of most interesting to least interesting, which sounds like a pretty arbitrary order, but the thing is I tried to do it from low end to high end and high end to low end, and I didn't really like doing that because the low end boards, like starting with the low end boards just puts me in a bad mood, and starting with the high end boards also puts me in a bad mood because the high end boards cost too much, the low end boards suck too much, and there's a really nice mid-range from like $130 to $180, and then outside of that it's kind of a lot of silly motherboards that I really don't get the justification for why they exist.
Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2060 KO. We previously reviewed the RTX 2060 KO model for its fused down RTX 2080 die that uniquely benefited Blender and some professional applications, offering better performance than expected in some pro workloads while offering usual strong RTX 2060 performance for gaming. The RTX 2060 KO also includes the game Deliver Us the Moon for free with EVGA GeForce RTX cards. EVGA is actively restocking its RTX 2060 KO with new dies, which you can find linked in the description below.
We're going ATX, then MATX, then ITX boards, so we're not just like, that's the order of the form factors because I didn't want to mix the form factors, it didn't make any sense. Also, the list is extremely nitpicky because there's too many motherboards that are kind of too similar. Like, there's a lot of motherboards where it's like, well, technically these two have very similar power delivery, and then one of them has 2 more USB ports and they cost the same amount of money. Well, the one that made it onto the list is the one with the 2 extra USB ports. So let's get into it. Starting off with the B550 Steel Legend. This board is on the list for a very simple reason. It has a postcode. It costs around $180. And it comes with a postcode. As far as I'm aware, this is basically one of the cheapest cheapest AM4 motherboards to come with a postcode. And I'm a huge fan of postcodes. They make overclocking so much easier. Postcodes are great. I love postcodes, so this board gets onto the list. You also get an internal Type-C USB header on this board, 6 SATA ports. The rear I/O is pretty decent. You get your 2.5 gig Realtek LAN, which is standard at this price point, which, again, like the boards are extremely similar, so I was very nitpicky. You have a good number of USB ports, and the board also has a VRM that is perfectly capable of powering a 3950X. It's not the coolest running VRM at this price point, but it is capable of powering a 3950X without overheating. So, you know, like, you don't need more than that as far as I'm concerned. Like, the VRM doesn't need to run at 60 degrees. It just has to not overheat. That's my personal criteria for that. And this VRM does that, and I'd say most of that is down to ASRock's not so great VRM heatsink designs, and also the fact that for some reason they're running the VRM at 600 kilohertz switching frequency, which just, like, in my personal testing, higher switching frequencies generally don't translate into much of anything, but because of how the modern voltage controllers work, but yeah, like, the VRM, like, it's fine. There's some weird design decisions, but ultimately it still works, so I'm not going to complain about it too much. It's just kind of, like, that's weird. Now, there are some downsides with this board. Like, there are some sacrifices you make in order to get the postcode. This does only use a 4-layer PCB, so it might be worse at memory overclocking when running a lot of RAM. This won't affect you if you're just running, like, 2 sticks of memory, or yeah, like 2 sticks or just 4 single rank sticks, you're not going to have problems. It's only if you're going to be like running 4 dual rank sticks that you might start running into issues. And so, like, for memory setups that you'd actually run on a board like this, because this is a $180 board, I'd assume you might go with like a 3900X and 32 gigs of RAM. That's going to work just fine. 3950X, 32 gigs of RAM, going to work just fine. 3700X, 32 gigs of RAM, going to work just fine. In fact, this board is very overkill for a 3700X. So the memory overclocking for reasonable amounts of memory is going to be just fine. And the other thing is, a lot of the time, if you're going for 64 gigs of memory, you've kind of given up on any semblance of memory overclocking anyway, because very large memory capacities tend to clock like crap regardless of memory topology anyway. It's just kind of, it's the price you pay for having high density memory. Anyway, so that's one of the downsides with this board, is like the memory overclocking might not be as strong. The issue is the like BIOSes can also make huge differences to that. And so for Ryzen 3000 though, in my testing, like, I've just not noticed any issues. When it comes to the one other downside is this board doesn't have any kind of BIOS flashback functionality. which most of the other boards at this price point do have. But the reason why this board made it onto the list is I've used BIOS flashback I think twice in my entire computer building career. The main reason for BIOS flashback to be on a motherboard is so that you can update the BIOS of the motherboard to a BIOS that supports a CPU that isn't already supported by the motherboard. But currently, you can only buy Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, which are going to be supported on every BIOS that this motherboard ships with from the factory. So that's not a concern. So yeah, this, like, if you want a postcode on your motherboard, this is a really, really cool board for that. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of that. Also, with B550 motherboards, that extra PCIe slot right there is X4 running through the... Actually, no, there's some that run it at X8, but it still goes through the chipset. Unless you're looking at the very expensive B550s, that extra PCIe, like 16x PCIe slot, doesn't go particularly fast. So this board technically supports AMD Crossfire. Running Crossfire through a chipset is very much possible. It's also really bad. And I know that because I've done it. You don't want to run Crossfire through a chipset. That PCIe slot is more for like networking cards, maybe extra SSDs or something. I would not try to run GPUs through it. Or maybe if you just have a GPU for extra display outputs, but I wouldn't actually try to run Crossfire off of that. Anyway, moving on to the other $180 motherboard. So this is, this doesn't have a postcode. If this had a postcode, the Steel Legend wouldn't be able to get onto the list because this thing is really, really cool. Well, the thing is, this board is missing the internal Type-C header, so you don't have that. And instead of a postcode, you just have troubleshooting LEDs, which... like, you can live with those on AMD. It's not as important to have a postcode on AMD as it is to have it on Intel. But yeah, this doesn't have the postcode, which I find kind of annoying. You do still get 6 SATA ports. You get a similar VRM, as in still a 12-phase with 50 amp power stages, and a better heatsink on that VRM. So this will actually run cooler, also because this has 2 more, like, this is on an actual 6-layer PCB, whereas the Steel Legend, as far as I can tell, is a 4-layer PCB. So the memory overclocking on this board is also probably going to be stronger. I say probably because BIOS makes such a huge difference. That also, like, layer count, like, having more layers tends to lead to better memory overclocking. It doesn't always lead to better memory overclocking. There are some very high layer count boards out there that suck. Anyway, the rear I/O on this, I'm a huge fan of because I'm a sucker for USB ports, and apparently Gigabyte knows that because that's a lot of USB ports. You've also got your BIOS Q-Flash, so you can update the BIOS of the board without having a CPU installed, and you also have the 2.5 gig Realtek LAN. So if you want a postcode at $180, this exists. If you don't care that much about having a postcode, this is all-round probably a better motherboard. Like, this is all-round somewhat better. I am a huge sucker for postcodes, though. Like, between USB ports and postcodes, I will take postcodes. Unless you have, like, 5 USB ports in total. If you have 5 USB ports in total, then I'll live without the postcode. Anyway, the thing with this board is you do get 2 PCIe X16 slots, which you might think, like, oh, so this, like, it supports Crossfire. Oh, they don't even list it. But this does technically support Crossfire because Crossfire will run basically on everything, even though it's, like, sometimes, like, Crossfire will run on things where it shouldn't even work. And you can see that when it runs really, really badly. But anyway, so these 2 PCIe slots go through the chipset again, so... yeah, basically the same issues. You run into the same issues as with this PCIe slot right here. Those 2 slots squeeze through the chipset. The chipset has a 4x 3.0 link to the CPU, so you can't really push that much bandwidth through those 2 slots right there. Anyway, so that's the B550 Aorus Pro, and these 2 are kind of the most expensive B550 motherboards I would be willing to buy. If I was going for a 3900X, I would actually... I'd probably lean towards this board in general. Just, again, I really like postcodes, unless you're planning to run, like, a lot of memory, in which case you might want to go for the Aorus Pro. The thing is, ASRock has recently also stopped having a terrible BIOS. Or at least it's less terrible than it used to. It's about on par with Gigabyte at this point, in my opinion. And so, you know, it's just like, well, I can't really... You know, and I think Gigabyte BIOS is fine, so ASRock BIOS is fine, it's just the layout's a bit weird. Yeah, so between these 2, for me, the decision is very, very difficult. It would, depends on what you want to do, right? Really depends on what you want to do. Either of them is fully capable of running a 3950X, so, you know, you can't even use the VRM as, like, deciding criteria. This does run cooler. Anyway, moving on, we have the B550 Aorus Elite. This is $160, so this is $20 cheaper than these two previous boards. This is on a 4-layer PCB. You only get 4 SATA ports. There's still no internal Type-C header. Wait, this doesn't even have an internal USB. No, there's a USB 3.0 right there. Okay, but this does have the same VRM as the B550 Pro, but this is on a 4-layer PCB. The heat sinks are worse. The memory overclocking on this thing might be terrible based on the fact that Gigabyte in their specifications, yeah, that is not even remotely confidence inspiring. At the same time, this is really bad. Let's just put it that way. Like 4,000, I have B450 motherboards that go over that. And I'm not aware of any B450 motherboard that has a 6-layer PCB. And the one I tested doesn't have a 6-layer. That's a 4-layer PCB, and that board will go up to 4400 with the appropriate memory. And so having a B550 board where you're advertising only 4000 megahertz support is kind of like, what did you do to the memory topology? Why is it spec'd so low? Now, they might be just being very cautious with overstating how good the memory overclocking is, but yeah, that right there is not what I would consider confidence inspiring. The thing is, at the end of the day, if you're running a Ryzen 3000 CPU, you don't want to go over 3800 anyway, because that's where the FCLK tops out. And we still get a really solid rear I/O with 2.5 gig Realtek LAN. There's also no Type-C port. I still consider this solid. Personally, don't care about Type-C at all. But yeah, there's no internal header for Type-C. There's no Type-C on the rear I/O. You do still get the Q flash, 2.5 gig LAN. So basically, this is kind of a lot of VRM attached to not a lot of motherboard. But if all you're interested in is hammering a 3950X, this is going to do a great job of that, right? Like, this is really going to do a great job of that. And so that's why that gets onto the list. Now, alternatively, if you want more features and don't care so much about the VRM, there's the B550A Pro from MSI. This is $140. This is what I would consider the sweet spot B550 motherboard if you aren't considering one of the high core count CPUs, though this should still be able to handle a 3900X, as this does use a revised version of the X470 Gaming Pro Carbon VRM, which was a very capable VRM. It's going to depend how much airflow you have. And in fact, depending on how much airflow your case has, you could even get away with a 3950X on this. So yeah, the VRM here is very capable. It's just not as ridiculously good as the B550, as the Elite or the Pro or the Steel Legend, because all three of these boards are various implementations of a 12-phase V-core using 50 amp power stages with a 2-phase SoC. And then this right here, we're looking at a 10-phase V-core, but using discrete MOSFETs instead of 50 amp power stages. And discrete MOSFETs, the thing is, you can get some really nice discrete MOSFETs that you don't normally see them used on motherboards, because that's not sort of those are normally used for driving brushless motors or that kind of thing. You don't really see them used in VRMs very frequently. Or on GPUs. GPUs, for some reason, are very happy to use discrete MOSFETs instead of power stages a lot of the time, but anyway, so you still get a solid VRM, better rear I/O than the Elite, depending on if you care about a Type-C or not. You still get BIOS flashback. This is on 1 gig Realtek LAN, so no more 2.5 gig at this price point, but that's normal. As soon as you go below $155, you lose the 2.5 gig. You have to spend at least $155 for the 2.5 gig. This does have troubleshooting LEDs, which the B550 Elite doesn't have. This also has six SATA ports. It has an internal Type-C. So this is an all-around, also this is on a 4-layer PCB, though I suspect, MSI's B450 motherboards with 4-layer PCBs do a perfectly good job of memory overclocking. So I don't know what Gigabyte did here, that they're only claiming support for 4000 on this. And the thing is, so this is probably actually going to be a better memory overclocker than the Elite is. That's the reason why I'd consider this the sort of baseline B550 motherboard, because it's if you want this is going to have no problem with a 3600 or a 3700X. 3900X depends how far you push it. 3950X, doable given the correct environmental variables like airflow and ambient temperature. So I'm a really big fan of this board. As well. This is a really cool board because you kind of get a little bit of everything, and you get it at $140. So, and I think the X470 Gaming Pro Carbon was also roughly $140. So this is a really good replacement for that board. Like in terms of both, well, everything. It's basically the same feature set. So yeah, I really like this board. This is definitely a solid option. Now let's move on to the MATX boards. Here we've got the Tough Gaming B550M Plus, as well as the B550M Mortar from MSI. Both of these are $160. Both of them made it into the list because we have significant differences between the two boards. So this has color-coded troubleshooting LEDs. You also get a 8 power stage 4-phase V-Core VRM, which funnily enough, both of these have that. Like this is also a 4-phase V-Core, but with 2 power stages in each phase. Now the difference in the power delivery is that this is on 50 amp power stages, where this is on 60 amp smart power stages. And technically I should be calling these DR-MOS, but the distinction between like DR-MOS and power stages is, it's like they're very similar. Like, especially because some of the DR-MOS components will have a lot of feature overlap with, like, cheaper power stages. So it's just like, I just use power stages for everything. So this is a slightly weaker VRM. The MSI board also has a bigger heatsink. But the thing is, the ASUS has the better rear I/O, as in you get more USB ports, BIOS flashback, you get your Type-C, 2.5 gig Realtek LAN. And then if we look at the Mortar, we've got 2.5 gig Realtek LAN, but like no USB ports. This is basically what I'd expect from an ITX board. You still get your BIOS flashback though. So this is like, I want more VRM, and this is, I want more rear I/O. That's the reason why you'd go for this board instead of this board, or vice versa. It's also worth noting that this one has, in my opinion, the less silly PCIe slot layout, because if you have a triple slot GPU, which is not that rare these days, you can still use your chipset attached X4 PCIe slot at the bottom. With the Tough, you can't. Or actually, you don't even need a triple slot card, you just need like a 2.5 slot card, and you're not going to be able to plug anything into that second 16X slot. Now, admittedly, ASUS realized that that might be a bit of an issue, and so you have a 1X at the top, like above the 16X, but there's a lot of devices that like need a 4X. So yeah, this PCIe slot layout is worse. You've got your 4 SATA ports. There's no internal Type-C on this board. This board does get internal Type-C, and this also has 6 SATA ports. So, very different approach, like different options in terms of connectivity, better VRM. This also has troubleshooting LEDs. They're just not color-coded, which I find rather annoying, but ultimately it's not that big a deal. Also, I think this is on a 4-layer PCB, and I have no idea how many layers this board has. It might also be it's probably also a 4-layer. Like, 6-layer PCBs tend to be kind of expensive, though at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, on the X570-P, which was literally the cheapest X570 board they made, they still had a 6-layer PCB. So they have some weird prioritization with, like, how many layers a motherboard has. So yeah, there's a chance this might be on a 6-layer, but ultimately, I wouldn't like pay too much attention to that. I'd mostly just decide based on the features. So anyway, moving on to the cheaper B550 MATX boards, we've got the B550M Aorus Pro. Now, I'm not a fan of the PCIe slot layout because, again, if you have a triple slot GPU, you lose the X16, but this still has a rather decent VRM, as in we've got a 10 plus 3 phase, and that's actually, well, it's a 5 phase with doublers, but that is a 10 phase V-Core. And the thing is, this is on a bunch of discrete MOSFETs. So this VRM is going to run hot. This can handle a 3950X with some amount of airflow. This can handle a 3950X with a lot more airflow, because this is actually a similar phase count and VRM design to what you'd have on the Dash 8 Pro, but the MOSFETs are significantly worse on this board. Also, the heatsink, like the main V-Core heatsink, has this great big plastic airflow restrictor. But the thing is, this board is $130, so you're probably not going to be pairing it with a 3950X. It's probably going to, like, at most, I would use a 3900X in this. And, if you're not overclocking, then it doesn't really matter. A stock 3950X on this is going to be fine. A stock 3900X on this is going to be fine. So that's not really the concern. There's no troubleshooting LEDs, which I find rather annoying, and you only get 4 SATA ports. There's also no internal Type-C header, but the thing is, there's just not that many motherboards at this price point in general. The rear I/O, on the other hand, I think is actually quite good. We've got a good number of USB ports, Q flash, you even get your rear I/O Type-C, which is kind of weird, because this board is cheaper than the Elite, and the Elite doesn't get the Type-C, right? Like, But that's feature segmentation for you. 1 gig Realtek LAN, because this is a sub $160 board. So yeah, you know, if you're going for like a basic, like 3600, 3700X, I'd be fully confident in running it in this board. 3900X, 3950X, that's stock, sure. 3900X overclocking, gonna need some airflow. 3950X with overclocking, gonna need a lot of airflow. Ultimately, this got onto the list because mostly the rear I/O, because a lot of the other things on, as well as the VRM. Like this is actually, at this price point, this is the best VRM you can get on a MATX board. So yeah, no, I'm really not a fan of the PCIe slot configuration. Like, it basically makes it an ITX board as soon as you install a GPU that's a little bit too thick. Anyway, moving on, we've got the B550M Pro 4 at $115. If you're running a 3600, it's going to be fine. If you're running a 3700X, it's going to be fine. If you're running a 3950X at stock, this should still be fine. The VRM on this is terrible. But the thing is, it has a very large heatsink, or at least very large by the standards of motherboards in this price range. The crazy thing is you can actually get a roughly $125 board that doesn't have a VRM heatsink at all, so this is actually not that bad. You still got a VRM heatsink. I can't believe I just said that. So yeah, like I wouldn't really buy this for heavy overclocking. But it does have really nice connectivity. You've got 6 SATA ports. You've got does this, wait, no, this does. Okay. So there's no Type-C internally, is there? No, there isn't. But yeah, you get your 6 SATA ports internally. The rear I/O is not bad. Good number of USB ports, 1 gig Realtek LAN. The PCIe slot layout makes more sense than what you've got on the AORUS Pro. Though the reason why Gigabyte actually does this layout is it gets your primary M.2, like your CPU attached M.2 SSD away from the heat of the GPU. And it's just like, it depends on what you're prioritizing. If you care more about SSD performance or GPU or, well, actually, no, it's not even a performance thing. Like if you just want more stuff in your PCIe slots, you can't use this. So yeah, this is more flexible in terms of connectivity. Worse power delivery. So this, I wouldn't, like a 3950, stock you'll be fine, but I wouldn't want to overclock like even a 3900X on this. Though again, it depends on your, case airflow. The thing is, given enough airflow, you can make very inadequate VRMs still not overheat, but at some point you get to the point where the fan is going so fast that you no longer want to be in the same room as the system that fan is cooling. But, for basic B550 builds, this is going to be completely fine. This doesn't have any BIOS flashback functionality, which is one of the sort of more noteworthy downsides with this board, but it does have troubleshooting LEDs, which you don't get on the B550M AORUS Pro. I don't know why Gigabyte is so stingy with the troubleshooting features. Now then, the cheapest motherboard in this entire roundup is the B550M DS3H. You get Q-Flash, yay! You get a VRM heatsink, yay! You get 4 SATA ports, okay. You get the horrible PCIe slot layout again. And the rear I/O is actually quite, I think this is a perfectly good rear I/O, especially for the price point. 1 gig Realtek LAN, of course. But yeah, if you don't need the connectivity that this offers, or you don't plan to run like a 3950X, because the thing is, a stock 3950X or a stock 3900X is a 140 watt CPU. I would not trust this with a stock 3950X. For a 3600 or even the 8 cores, this is going to be fine if you're not doing any overclocking, but like this is for non-overclocked builds. The thing is, there's not really any cheaper options anyway. Like this is the only motherboard at this price point, and this board is around $100, like $95 to $100. So that's the only reason it's on the list. And at least, you get your Q-Flash, you get a VRM heatsink, and you get a decent rear I/O. But this is just not my kind of board, and that's why it's towards the end of the video, because I don't really want to spend too much time on it. But yeah, it could be worse. It could be, but this is already really quite bad. At least the VRM is better than what you'd get at the same price point on B450 Gigabyte motherboards, which that VRM was terrible. Anyway, now we get to the ITX boards. At $180, we've got the B550 AORUS Pro AX. This is, in my opinion, one of the few B550 ITX boards that makes any sense, mostly because a lot of the other ones cost as much as X570 B550 boards, and at that point it's like, but why wouldn't you just buy the X570 ones instead, right? Like, they cost the same. Anyway, rear I/O is what you would expect of a ITX motherboard, though you do still get Q-Flash and Wi-Fi 6, as well as 2.5 gig Realtek LAN. The VRM on this is a 6 plus 2 phase, 90 amp smart power stages, but this is still, like, this is going to need airflow. That heatsink just isn't big enough, depending on what exactly you're doing with the system, of course. At stock, it's going to be fine. It's just, if you're going to be overclocking a 3900X or a 3950X, yeah, you're going to need some airflow because that heatsink right there just, it's not large enough. The thing is, a lot of ITX cases are so cramped that the fan's jammed right up against the motherboard a lot of the time anyway, so that's kind of why this might actually work out just fine. I don't actually build ITX systems. The only reason why I find ITX motherboards very interesting is because they have 2 DIMM slots, which makes them better at memory overclocking than all of your 4 DIMM ATX boards. So, yeah, and you do still get, your 4 SATA ports, and that's kind of it for this board. Like, there's not really much to talk about. It's just it's basically a slightly cheaper version of the X570 ITX board that Gigabyte put out. So, and that's a win. Like, that's, in my opinion, the main point of B550 is to give a feature build quality equivalent to, like, a build quality equivalent X570 board just at a lower price point. And especially, like, the thing is, here you even get feature equivalents because the X570 chipset on an ITX board just doesn't really have that, like, there's not that much you can connect to it at that point. So, yeah, this is kind of the most expensive ITX B550 motherboard I would consider buying, because the more expensive ones, it's like, but I could just get an X570 instead at that point. So, yeah, anyway, alternatively, there's the B550M ITX. This is the cheapest B550 ITX board. And, like, I wish I could say it's good, but, so this is kind of funny. So the VRM on this, so the thing that's hiding under that joke of a heatsink, is actually quite decent. It's a 6 plus 2 phase using 50 amp power stages, so if you're running like a 3600 or a 3700X, you're not going to have any issues. But the problem is, yeah, that right there is supposed to cool the VRM. I'm pretty sure if you spend $5 on, like, those memory chip heatsinks for GPUs and just glue a bunch of those right on top of the VRM heatsink right there, it's going to significantly improve the thermals. That's actually something I really want to try test out because, like, there's just no heatsink to start with. Like, it should make a pretty major difference. The rear I/O is actually, not bad, though. It's 1 gig Realtek, 1 gig Realtek LAN, and just Wi-Fi 5 or Wi-Fi AC, as it used to be known. But yeah, this is roughly the rear I/O you'd expect from an ITX board. And for a 36, like, for, a lower core count CPU ITX build, this is completely fine. It's just that, yeah, that VRM right there is very, like, that heatsink is terrible. But the thing is, this is a $130 ITX board, and compared to, like, B450 ITX boards, this is, technically, there's, like, one B450 ITX board that has a better VRM than this. So this is not actually that bad. It's mostly just, I don't know why they didn't spend $5 more on the heatsink. Or they could have scrapped the M.2 heatsink and given you a better VRM heatsink. So yeah, if you want a cheap ITX board for your 3600 or a 3700X build, this is kind of the only option, because again, there's no other motherboard, no other B550 ITX boards at this price point that would compete against this. So even though this, in my opinion, is not exactly a spectacular motherboard, it could be worse, like, so, and it doesn't have any competition. So yeah, it gets onto the list. So that is it for all of the noteworthy B550 boards. I'd start with this, and then if you like the feature set of, like, the Steel Legend or the Pro or the Elite more, then you could go for one of those. If you want something cheaper, well, you can go, well, actually, I wouldn't, actually, I don't think there's any cheaper oh no, there are cheaper ATX boards. They're just worse than the MATX boards. So yeah, that's the thing. If you want a cheaper board than this, then you start dropping down to, like, the B550M Aorus Pro or the B550M Pro 4 from ASRock, because ASRock does actually make roughly similarly priced ATX boards to the B550M Pro 4. They just have the same VRM, but with a worse heatsink. So it's just like, why on earth would you buy that? Like, those are just worse boards at the same price. And yes, they're ATX, but it's just like, are you actually, like, if you're buying a board this cheap, do you actually care about the extra PCIe slots that gives you? Probably not. You're mostly buying the board because you need a cheap board, in which case get the MATX ones. So yeah, that's it's kind of that. These are, in my opinion, the most interesting B550 motherboards. And as I mentioned at the start, there are plenty of boards that didn't make it into the list that are perfectly acceptable. It's just that they don't offer any interesting features, in my opinion, and so they didn't make it. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what we do here at Gamers Nexus, we've got a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. Or you can also buy some of the Gamers Nexus merch on store.gamersnexus.net. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.